Okay, we ready?
We are not quite live. Just one moment.
Microphone check.
Sounds good. I can hear you.
I apologize, Mayor. Just give me a couple more minutes. We just got to switch up one thing real quick.
Okay.
Good morning, team. I do apologize. There's an issue with the YouTube link. Please afford us just a couple more minutes. Good morning, Mayor. You may now proceed.
Sorry, you caught me on a different screen. Okay, we're ready. Just a second. Let me pull this up. Okay, good morning. My name is Esther Manheimer. I'm chair of the Policy, Finance, and HR Committee for the City of Asheville, and I'd like to welcome you to the September 12th remote meeting. All council committee members and staff are participating virtually. To help our audience follow along, I'll state each section of the agenda aloud. We are streaming live on our Virtual Engagement Hub, which is accessible through the Virtual Engagement Hub link on the front page of the city website. We also have an option for the public to listen live by phone. For those of you out there today with us, welcome. For today's meeting, we have the option for people to call in and comment live during the meeting. To call in and comment live, use the same number, 855-925-2801, meeting code 5257. Your phone will be muted and you'll hear the meeting live. At this point, speakers will need to push *3 to enter the speaker queue. I'll now go through and introduce all committee members and staff who are participating virtually. Council and staff, as I call your name, please say a quick hello. Councilwoman Maggie Ullman.
Good morning, everybody.
Councilwoman Kim Roney.
Good morning.
City Manager Deborah Campbell.
Good morning.
City Attorney Brad Branham.
Good morning.
Assistant City Manager Jamie Matthews.
Good morning.
Finance Director Tony McDowell.
Morning, everybody.
Senior Budget Analyst Abigail Riley.
Good morning, everyone.
And today we also have Vice President of Raftellus, Melissa Levin.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, the first item on our agenda is the adoption or the approval of the minutes. Do I have a motion to approve the minutes?
This is Kim, so moved.
It's Maggie, second.
Okay, and I'll do a roll call vote. Councilwoman Kim Roney.
Aye.
Councilwoman Maggie Ullman.
Aye.
And myself, aye. So the minutes are approved. The first item of business is the water cost of service study presentation. And I'm guessing I turned it over to Ben, but I don't know. Nope, I'm turning over to Tony.
Yeah, turning over to me, Mayor. Thank you very much. And good morning, Mayor and committee members, Tony McDowell.
Tony, just real quick, it looks like Councilwoman Roney has raised her hand.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Sorry for the interruption. I just know for folks that might be watching either this meeting live stream or archived, this is the anticipated rate study that we've been talking about.
Okay. Jump back in, Tony McDowell, Finance Director. I'm going to kick things off today with the presentation and do a little introduction. Then I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Levin and Vanessa Waller from Raftellus, our consultant who completed the cost of service study for us. We also have on the meeting this morning David Melton from the Water Resources Department, our director there, and other staff who probably can answer some questions as well if they come up. So we can go to the next slide. So as always, we're going to start with some key takeaways from the presentation today. And really what we're doing today is we're picking up with a conversation that we left off with you all back during the budget process. And if you all remember back then, there was a lot of discussion around the water rates, the water rate structure, and staff indicated at that time that there was a water cost of service study that was already planned, and that study would help us better understand the rate structure and make recommendations moving forward. That would include three things. It would include defining the cost of service by functional area, assessing the rate structure and making recommendations for an equitable and functional rate model moving forward, and would incorporate all of these changes into an updated financial planning model. So again, that's kind of where we left off the conversation with council back in April. And so why we're here today. So we have some preliminary results from the study. And what those results confirmed is that the rates do need to be realigned to equitably reflect the cost of providing service, particularly between the residential, commercial, and wholesale customer classes. We've also want to report out today that based on the multi-year financial projections that we're working with Raptalis on and the funding challenges within the water system itself, these preliminary findings also suggest that it is unlikely that residential rates can be reduced any further. And then finally, the last key takeaway we wanted to highlight for you all is that we're going to continue working with Raptalis over the next couple of months to take the data that they have developed for us already, use that to develop some specific rate recommendations, and bring that back for City Council's consideration in December. So we can go to the next slide. So again, before I turn it over to Melissa and her team to kind of walk through the results of the study, just wanted to start with an introduction and kind of give you all a quick system overview. And this may be for folks out in the community who maybe don't know a whole lot about our water system, but it is a large municipal operation. There's a little over 60,000 accounts or customers that we have within the water system. And somewhere between 40 and 45% of those customers are within the city limits, and the rest are outside the city limits. And that's kind of the information on the left there. And then on the right, we have customer usage by class. And you can see here, if you look at the chart on the left, you can see that 53,000 out of the 60,000 accounts are residential. So that's about 90% of the accounts within the system are residential. But if you look at the chart on the right and look at usage and look at the percentage there, you'll see that residential use and commercial use are almost identical. And so they're both somewhere between 35 to 40% of the total usage within the system. So that kind of gives you all a snapshot of the customer base and the usage within the water system. So we can go to the next slide. So just to, again, a little more background information. So the water department, it's the largest department in the city by total budget at $44 million. It's the second largest fund in the city after the general fund. And this pie or donut chart gives you all kind of a breakdown of what that $44 million budget looks like. And one thing I would point out here is when we show you all charts like this for the general fund, you will see that the majority of expenses are in the personnel category. And the water fund's a little different, and that's mainly because there is extensive capital infrastructure that has to be maintained in the water, within the water operations. And so a substantial part of the budget, about a third of the budget, actually goes toward paying for current capital and paying debt on previous capital expenditures. So we can go to the next slide. So just to highlight quickly some of the challenges that we face with the water system here, I think you all are aware of the local legislation that prohibits charging differential rates between customers inside the city and outside the city. A lot of systems across the state do charge differential rates. And so kind of thinking back to that previous slide that showed that just under half of our customers are within the city, obviously it would have a huge impact if the city of Asheville were able to charge higher rates to outside customers, and it impacts the overall rate structure. And I think Melissa and her team are going to talk a little bit more about that during their presentation. As an enterprise fund, the water budget's based solely on fees and charges, so there's no property tax revenue, no sales tax revenue that goes into supporting the fund. And then a key thing to point out, and again, Melissa's going to talk a little bit more about this, and you all are going to see the impact of this on the next slide I show you. And it's really one of the reasons we're here today having this conversation, is that the Water Resources Fund lost the ability to collect a capital improvement fee about 3 years ago. There was a court settlement. That fee was eliminated. We've been trying to recover the revenue over the last few years through the regular water rates, and it has had a substantial impact on the overall fund budget as well as the funds that are available to go to capital improvements. And having funds available to go toward capital is very, very important. And you saw again on that previous slide the amount of the budget that does go to capital and infrastructure investment within the water system. Mayor, question?
I just wanted to contextualize that. That lawsuit was not just with the city of Asheville. Actually, it was several cities, and we sort of saw the writing on the wall. And I think in that and worked out changes to our system, but it affected cities in North Carolina, many cities in North Carolina who've had to try to adjust to the results of that lawsuit.
Yes, that's correct.
Tony, I can ask you a question about, you mentioned that a slide showed the number of customers within the city versus outside the city when you were talking about differential rates. I see the system overview slide. Am I missing something? I don't see any of the number of customers. I know we have all these wholesale customers. Some of those are whole cities. So,
yeah, I have that data in my notes. I'm sorry, that is actually not in the slide. I misspoke when I said that data is in the slide.
So what does that kind of look like in terms of the number of, actually, it's probably more relevant in terms of usage inside and outside the city, because that's what, and I think, just again, to emphasize the point, Asheville has local legislation that restricts it from not charging a differential rate for customers inside our city limits versus outside. And that is unlike other cities in North Carolina who are allowed to charge a differential rate and do charge a differential rate. But anyway, if you know what those numbers look like, great.
Yeah, I think I see another hand raised.
Well, Tony, can you say what the number is?
In terms of the usage inside versus outside. David, I don't know, David Melton, if you're
do you have the number of customers? Is that what you were saying? You said you had something in your notes.
And we can get you the exact number on this as well, but we estimate that currently somewhere between 40 and 45% of the customers are within the city, and then the rest are outside the city.
Thanks.
Councilmember Roney?
Thank you. So I'm curious about our narrative here. I do acknowledge that we can't charge differential rates to folks that are outside the city limits. However, residential water customers do not have the ability to capture outside revenue, while our commercial users can pass along the cost in the services and goods they sell, which is the only way that we can work with our community to make sure our water system has quality service while working together to capture outside revenue. And I think that it is a pro-business solution to have a quality service system. I think we would all acknowledge that. But I just wanted to make sure that when we're talking about the inability to capture outside revenue, that might be a missed opportunity if we're not looking at bringing the commercial rates up.
Okay, and we'll look more closely with Ms. Campbell. I see you have a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that this is really just an overview. The details will be presented by Melissa, and we will be able to demonstrate one of the objectives of creating a more equitable rate system, and that will be forthcoming. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to do that twice.
So just to quickly highlight the last bullet on this page, and then we'll move on, and I'll turn it over to Melissa here quickly. So as I mentioned, the water resources operation is a large operation. We do have to issue debt associated with the capital improvements that we make, and that requires us to go to the LGC, to the rating agencies, and so the first thing they always want to see when we start talking to them about issuing debt is, do we have a multi-year financial plan in place that is sustainable, that'll provide enough resources for the fund over time to pay for the operations as well as the debt service. So we can go to the next slide, and then I'll finish up. And so this next slide, again, is just highlighting the impact of losing that capital improvement fee back in fiscal year 21, and the ability to fund capital from the water operating fund has gone down substantially since that time. So with that and with time in mind, I will end there, and I will turn it over to Melissa Levin from Raftalis. I think we have a separate slide deck for their presentation. Thank you all.
Perfect. So good morning, everyone. Thank you all for allowing us to be here with you guys today. I'm Melissa Levan with Raftellus, and I have Vanessa Waller with me here as well. And we're really excited to discuss with you all our kind of preliminary findings of the cost of service and rate study that we've done for the water department. So, next slide. So for our agenda today, what we're going to do is we're going to do a little study overview, kind of the 4 different pieces of the rate study. And then we're going to get into really the financial planning, the cost of service concept, and the rate design. Those 3 pieces really make up those components of the rate study. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk you through each one of those components just to give you a general understanding of what we mean when we say financial planning, cost of service, rate design. Then what we're going to do is we're going to get into that cost of service analysis, the results of that cost of service analysis that we've done, our preliminary kind of findings and next steps, and then we're going to wrap up with any questions and answers that you guys, any questions that you may have, and provide answers for that. All right, next slide. Okay, next slide. I'm going to start just real quick, just a shameless plug. So Raftellus was started in 1993 here in Charlotte, North Carolina. We really, at that point in time, we did water and sewer financial planning and rate studies. We've grown over the last 30 years now. You can see we now cover the country. There's about 140 of us that do consulting work for Raftellus, and we've touched about at least 1,200 utilities and agencies across the U.S. And now we no longer just do financial planning, but we also do strategic planning, data technology, organizational assessments, all kinds of communications and other types of activities that kind of revolve around both utilities and cities and counties. I will say that our bread and butter really still is financial planning for water and sewer. So that's my expertise, and I'm excited to be here with you guys to talk about it. So next slide. Okay, so when we're looking at our project overview, and this is going to have some things that build, so just kind of fair warning, it's really 4 different pieces. It's a financial plan, it's a cost of service, it's a rate design piece, and it's a miscellaneous fee piece. What we mean by financial plan, just real quickly, and Vanessa's going to get into it in a little bit more detail, is we're talking about a financial plan. We're looking out over the next 5 to 10 years. What are your costs and what are the revenues that need to be generated to cover those costs, right? So it's your financial forecast. It's that level of rates that need to be generated. And then when you look at that second piece of the study, that cost of service, is the different customer classes. It's the residential class, the commercial, manufacturing, irrigation. Those level of revenues that need to be generated when we're looking out over that financial forecast. How should those revenues be generated? Which class are creating the cost, and are those classes of customers properly recovering those costs? So that cost of service is ultimately going to come up with buckets of cost, and we're going to make sure those different classes are covering those costs. Then we get into the rate design piece, which is after those buckets of cost have been allocated among the different customer classes, what is the rate structure that works for that particular customer class? And what creates fairness within that customer class, and what helps you to achieve the objectives that you need to achieve with your customer base. And then that last piece, that miscellaneous fees piece, those are your ancillary fees. Those are things such as your TAP fees, your customer service type fees, such as your late payment fees. We're also looking at those fees too, to make sure that the fees are set so that they're recovering the cost of providing that service. So those are the 4 different pieces of the study that we're working on. Yeah, sorry. So as you can see, the financial plan, it tells us how much money do we need. The cost of service is going to tell us, is everyone paying their fair share? And then you see the rate design. How can our rates ensure fairness within those customer classes? And then the last piece, the miscellaneous fees, those are those ancillary fees, and are we recovering those costs for providing that service? Okay, so next slide. So with this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Vanessa, and she's going to walk you through kind of each one of these components so you can understand, have a little better understanding of what each one means.
All right, thanks, Melissa. So as mentioned, I'll just give an overview of the key processes that we went through to build out our model, sort of in order, starting with financial planning, and then I'll cover cost of service, and then I'll end with the rate design piece, which is sort of the final step that we go through. So if you advance to the next slide, I've got some information to start us off with financial planning. So there are several steps that we go through to make sure we're coming up with a realistic projection of your future costs and revenues as well. That first step is to look at your operating cost. That's any ongoing cost, things like salaries, benefits, etc. And that certainly can be a driver of rate increases. But really, step two is arguably the bigger driver of a need to keep rates at a certain level, because that is your CIP or capital improvement plan funding. And we look at that to make sure that we have enough revenue coming in to support your future infrastructure investments. That would include things like your upcoming $75 million treatment plant project. Usually these are very big ticket items. Often they are debt funded. So that is a large part of what we look at when we're doing financial planning. And our third step is simply your existing debt service. We look at any debt service you have on the books from infrastructure you've previously funded. And then once you have all those three, you're really covering all of your costs and you have your revenue requirements assessed. So that brings us to step 4, which is to project revenues. And we do that by doing a detailed analysis of your billing data. That's usage and customer accounts. And we multiply that billing data by your existing rates. And that will give us a projection of future revenues. So that brings us to step 5, which is to compare your costs from steps 1 through 3 to your revenues in step 4. And we do a financial sufficiency evaluation. We just look at how are revenues stacking up against your cost, just to make sure that your costs are not too high year over year. And occasionally you'll see a year where costs do exceed revenues, but that's okay as long as you have sufficient reserves. So we're kind of monitoring cost versus revenues, making sure you aren't drawing too heavily on your reserves, and also monitoring your debt service coverage to make sure your debt coverage is at a suitable ratio. Next slide, please. So coming back to those first few steps in the process for your revenue requirements, on the left, you've got your operating and maintenance cost. Again, these are kind of ongoing costs you tend to have each year. Those include personnel, utilities, chemicals, supplies, maintenance, and some other miscellaneous smaller costs. It can also include things like equipment or vehicles that are, a little bit larger in volume or, in significance, but they tend to be recurring and they aren't quite big enough to make it into your capital improvement plan. So those are your operating costs. And this year we did see a budgeted increase in those costs. And so we did make sure that we accounted for the future budget to project off of for future years. Then on the right-hand side, we have our capital costs from your capital improvement plan. We also look at your existing debt, which includes both revenue bonds and loans. And we are also projecting any future debt issuances you may need. We look at your CIP and identify which projects will be debt funded and project out what we think would be a reasonable amount of debt service for those each year. Then in addition to that, we also include some project funding that is cash or pay-go funded, and those tend to be more rehabilitation projects, but that's a key component as well. And sometimes you'll either use cash or you will draw on your reserves for those. Next slide, please. All right, so one question we sometimes are asked is about the difference between a cost of service study and a rate study, and why we might be looking at a cost of service study for this project. So I kind of like to think of a cost of service study as like a very high resolution snapshot from a camera that gives a lot of detail. And the reason for that is because it only looks at 1 year of data. It's only looking at a single, what we call a test year, and it looks at all the different customer classes in very high levels of detail. So it's a little bit more data intensive than a typical rate study. In contrast, a financial planning or rate study, we're really just looking at the level of rate increases you need. For instance, do you need a 5% rate increase? Do you need a 10% rate increase to keep up with your costs escalating over the years? Now, in a rate study, we might also look at customer classes in terms of maybe putting, let's say, commercial at a 10% increase and residential at a 5% increase, but it's simply not as detailed as cost of service. The big takeaway is that cost of service is focused on equity among your customer classes. And because we did the more detailed cost of service study this year, we do anticipate that the fiscal year 2025 rates would be based on this recently completed study. Next slide. All right, so I'll talk a little bit more about the theory behind cost of service. Next slide. So at a high level, cost of service is all about achieving a fair and equitable rate structure. It attempts to recover the costs from users in proportion to their use of the system, recognizing the impact of each class on system facilities and operations. So again, equity and fairness are key concepts, and we're really focusing in on how each customer class uses your water infrastructure. Next slide, please. So when we do these cost of service studies, we use industry standard practices. We have several different sources that we draw on. One is the AWWA M1 manual. We also have our Raftellus textbook, the Water and Wastewater Finance and Pricing textbook. And these both include really commonly accepted industry practices that have been around for years. So we make sure that all of our models that we build are in line with these sources in terms of theory. Next slide, please. So this slide, I like it because I think it's a good high-level overview. I know there's a lot of information on here, but it's a good graphic to represent the most important parts of our cost of service model. So I'll start at the very top. You'll see that allocation of costs to functions. That is a really detailed section up there, but all that really is taking all of your revenue requirements and allocating those revenue requirements to various functions that the utility is responsible for. So for instance, you'll see they'll have supply, plant, transmission, distribution, meters, all those different functions that the utility has to account for. And we are just allocating our costs to those functions. And that second tier down, that allocation to cost components, that is when you take those previously allocated costs and do it a second time, sort of reallocating them once again. But this time we are looking at allocating to more like flow-based components and fixed charge components. So those include things like your base or average flow, peak flow when you have an unusually high demand on your water system. We also have something called readiness to serve in there, and that just represents the availability of your infrastructure 24/7 to provide water service. So those are just a few examples of rate components that we then allocate further, and that kind of leads us into that final step. We are looking at allocating those costs again to either fixed or service costs on the left, and also the customer classes on the right. So the left-hand side, those are going to be cost that is associated with the meter-based fixed charges, those base charges that you have each month or every other month in your case. And those will include meter costs, customer billing cost, et cetera. And then on the right-hand side, those customer classes, that tends to be everything else, every volumetric related cost. And that is where we look at the customer classes and how those different classes are putting demands on the water system. Next slide, please. All right, I'll talk a little bit more about rate design, which is our final process that we go through. Next slide, please. So even once you do that full cost of service process, the next step you have to think about is what are the rates that will best suit your goals and policies. And each utility is so unique that this is kind of a collaborative effort with staff. This slide just shows a really wide sampling of the various types of objectives that you might see for a typical utility. You have everything from just making sure you're financially self-sufficient at the very top in the middle there, financial sufficiency, economic development might be a goal. You have revenue stability, ease of implementation. Those are all different objectives that you could focus on for your rate design. Next slide. Here's an example of a plan to just prioritize, because not all of them can be the top priorities. All of them are good to have, but you have to be selective with how you prioritize. One example is if you want conservation rates. These can often conflict with revenue stability because you're charging lower rates for those lower levels of consumption rather than making all customers pay it at a higher rate, even if they're using a little bit less water. So then if your customer decides to conserve and use less, you might lose a little bit of revenue. So conservation and revenue stability tend to be a little bit in conflict. Another example, if you have higher fixed charges each month, that might give you more stability, but then might affect the affordability because customers may have less leverage to control that bill as they change their water usage. And this little graphic to the right, this shows our understanding of Asheville's priority objectives. Most importantly, we have financial sufficiency, affordability, cost of service allocations, and ease of implementation. Those were the objectives that stood out to us as we worked with staff on this project. And we really wanted to focus on that when we thought about what would future rate adjustments look like. Then on the other side, in the important category, rate stability, conservation, and revenue stability were absolutely important, but they weren't as highly emphasized. So again, we kind of were forced to rank these a little bit, but they're all things that we are keeping in mind as we move forward with staff. Next slide, please. So I know Tony touched a little bit on your current customers and rates, but just wanted to highlight your current rates once more to give some background. So on the left-hand side, one thing to mention is that most of your customers are charged a bi-monthly base charge. Some of them are charged monthly, and so that charge would be cut in half, the one that you see starting with $12.95, but most of them are bi-monthly. And those charges increase by meter size because that reflects the fact it takes a little more time and cost to maintain those larger metered connections. But most of your revenue actually comes from your volumetric rates on the right. These are charged per CCF. That's your unit of consumption. They're mostly uniform rates, regardless of usage. For instance, your single-family residential customers, they'll pay $5.21 for every CCF, even if they use a lot more water. In contrast, you've got your commercial and manufacturing that have a two-tiered structure. Commercial and manufacturing pay a slightly lower rate per CCF once they surpass that 2,000 CCF threshold. But other than that, it's a fairly straightforward rate structure with distinctions among various customer classes already. Next slide, please. So again, I know Tony kind of touched on this already, but when we look at which customers are actually paying which rates, that can kind of help us understand the significance of what would it mean to change the rate structure. One thing to note, of course, is the monthly versus bi-monthly. So that's something we can consider. I think that comes up on a future slide. Just, do we want to keep that distinction of bi-monthly versus monthly? One other thing worth noting here is that on the right side, you can see residential is the largest class, but you also have a lot of usage coming in from your commercial and manufacturing. So changing those rates would absolutely make a big difference in terms of revenues collected. Another class to highlight would be your wholesale. It is at the bottom, so it kind of is hard to notice it, I guess, but it's actually even more than your manufacturing class in terms of volume of water. So that would also make a big difference if you were to increase those wholesale rates. Now, of course, you only have a few wholesale customers. You have Woodfin Water and Sewerage, the town of Black Mountain and town of Biltmore Forest. But those are still generating quite a lot of flow. So that is another customer that we looked at in terms of cost of service. So I'll just highlight on the next slide a couple of objectives that the water department had. On the residential class, that's your largest customer base. It does make a big difference. We wanted to ensure that the rates were in line with cost of service, just to make sure everything was equitable. We also wanted to understand the increases needed to balance the revenue sufficiency with affordability. So both of those had to be in balance. And then we also were interested in exploring a tiered structure at some point. So that was something we examined with staff for residential. Then on your non-residential and wholesale side, fewer customers, but still quite a bit of usage. We wanted to also just really make sure that everyone was paying their equitable share of costs for the water department. So again, really relied on that cost of service to guide our next steps. So at this point, I'll turn it back over to Melissa, just to give a little bit more detail on the key takeaways from the cost of service analysis.
Okay, thanks, Vanessa. Okay, next slide. All right, so we've completed the cost of service analysis. And if you remember when we were talking about the cost of service analysis, we talked about buckets of cost. If you look on the right-hand side of this chart where we say current revenue, and then you look down the left-hand side where we've got the different customer classes, that is currently the way that your customer classes recover revenue. So residential class recovers about 49.6% of the revenue, commercial, the 28.5, irrigation 1.8, and so on down that right-hand side of the chart. When we did the cost of service study, we come up with the buckets of costs that should be recovered through or from each class. And so what you see right in the middle, that cost of service revenue, that is the revenue that should be generated from each customer class. So you see the 43.3% for residential, 32.4% for commercial. The one thing that should jump out at you when you're looking at these numbers is when you look at the current revenue for the residential class versus the cost of service revenue, that revenue that should be collected from that class. Currently, the residential class is over recovering in revenue. All of the other classes, commercial, irrigation, manufacturing, wholesale, are all under recovering. Multifamily is pretty much, right on target for what it should be recovering from that particular class. But basically, like I said, commercial, irrigation, manufacturing, wholesale are all under recovering. So there's an opportunity to make those rates more equitable by increasing those revenues from those particular classes a little bit more in relation to the other classes.
When you say under recovering, you mean for residential, they are paying more than what their cost of service actually is.
That is correct. And remember, this is a test year. So if we're looking, we did this based on fiscal year 24. So if we're looking at this particular year, what we're saying is it is anticipated that they're going to, based on all the rates that we've got and the cost, it is anticipated that this is the revenue that they will generate, and this is the revenue that they should generate.
And this is the total water bill, including any flat rates and usage rates, everything combined, right?
Everything combined, yes. All of the fixed charges and all of the volumetric charges. And that is for even the wholesale customer class as well, because I know wholesale pays what we call a capacity charge in addition to their volumetric charge. That has been factored in here as well. So it's basically everything that's being generated for each of those classes.
Ms. Ronnie.
Thank you. This is Councilmember Roney. I heard the word equity used a lot, and I wonder if you could help me understand which disparities we're attempting to address when we say equity.
So if you remember the chart that showed, it was a pretty detailed chart that Vanessa had flashed up there earlier, where we went through the detailed cost allocation. And that was where we took, all of the cost, and we said, these costs are attributable to treatment. These costs are attributable to pumping, transmission, distribution. And we went through that cost allocation kind of in detail. And then we allocated those costs to the different parts of the water system. We look at the way each of those customer classes are using that water system. And just to maybe kind of make it a little bit easier, if you think about a water system, the assets are really, very expensive, and you have to build a water system to accommodate peak usage. So, you can't just build it for the average usage, because, if you have a peak usage one day, or everyone's irrigating all at the same time, everyone's flushing the toilet, your plant's got to be able to accommodate that peak. So we've got to build that plant to accommodate the peak. We look at those customer classes and the way that they use that system, and which customer classes are creating that peak. So we're looking to see, okay, well, if this customer class is peaking more, they need more of those kind of peak costs. So that class gets assigned more of those peak costs. So when we're looking at all of those costs, the cost to have that infrastructure in place to serve that particular customer class, that's what we're calling kind of their equitable share.
Okay, that helps me understand a little bit. Since we're only looking at 1 year, it's a snapshot, right? So it doesn't tell our history and how we got here.
Right.
It also does not address the owning class versus renters, who owners of commercial properties are, the impact of, we have a long history of brewing and distilling here in the mountains. It's an exportable good, and it can be really good paying jobs. But it is, a use of our public system. And we also have our tourism industry with a significantly large number of short-term rentals. So I just wanted to be really clear that we're not talking about racial equity or class equity. We're talking about equity for commercial users.
Yeah, we're talking about the equity in terms of how that particular customer class uses the water system.
And not just commercial, across all class of customers.
Correct. Okay.
And Melissa, if I could just jump in and make one quick point. I mean, I think the discussion about the snapshot in time is great and important, because I think if you were to look back, let's say 4 or 5 years ago, when the CIP fee was still in place, these percentage breakdowns would be a lot different than they are today, or substantially different, I would say, maybe, because that fee did fall more heavily on the commercial class than it did on the residential class. So when that fee went away and the restructure took place, that's when a lot of the shift happened to the residential side.
Yeah. So next slide, and to Tony's point. So if you look on this chart here, we had that capital improvement fee charge in place till 2020, and it went away in 2021. So you can kind of see there, look down there towards the bottom of the page, that is kind of what that monthly fee looked like. Over on the right-hand side, when we look at the revenues that were generated from that CIP fee, it was $11.8 million roughly. That fee was more heavily weighted towards the larger meters, which are your commercial and manufacturing type customers. So when that fee was in place, it generated more revenue for those particular customer classes. So as we look at this particular test year that we were just discussing and those results, had we looked at it, back in 2020, the picture would have been a little bit different because you would have been generating, from proportionally kind of more revenue from those commercial and manufacturing classes. So the difference, that rate equity would not, or revenue equity would not probably have been as much then as what it is now. Okay. Next slide. So, based on what we saw for the cost of service analysis, as we kind of maybe go ahead and move to the next slide, what are we thinking? Staff would like to bring rates back to you guys in December. But what we're thinking for those rates that we're going to bring back in December is that we're going to keep a single tiered rate structure for that residential class for now. If you think about that residential class, it is the ones that are having the bi-monthly billing. A conservation rate structure really is put in place to discourage discretionary water use. Right now with the bi-monthly billing that you guys have, the conservation signal will get lost because if you think about it, they use the water and they only get billed every other month. So that conservation signal is not as effective as if it were done on a monthly basis. So the thinking would be that when you convert to monthly billing, that might be a better time to put in a tiered rate structure for that residential class. One of the things, as we think back to the cost of service study, the results that we saw, we know right now that residential class is over recovering relative to the other classes. We are most likely going to have a rate increase, but the rate increase for that particular class would not be, as much as some of the other classes that are currently under recovering.
Melissa, so, and the reason you're not recommending kind of a sooner switch is that we won't have the technical capacity for monthly billing until our meter switch out project. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, that is correct. I mean, we could go ahead and put another tier on there, but then we would just be probably needing to redo it once the monthly billing kind of goes into effect.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So any other questions for the residential customer class? So we're, based on the cost of service, that rate increase for that class relative to the other classes will be lower just because of the cost of service analysis results of that we looked at.
So would we see, would we sort of, would the idea be that we kind of adopt a schedule of rates that moves us in line with the cost of service over some period of time, like 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, I mean, whatever you all, and maybe I'm jumping the gun, but would that be the idea that we gradually move in that direction so that we level out the rates and we get them equal to the cost of service?
And I'm not sure if staff wants to hop in here, but I think, Esther, one of the things that we're thinking, we've got the cost of service analysis done. We're looking at that financial plan now, and that's going to determine that level of rate increases that's going to be needed. And so it's really just going to depend on, balancing the level of rate increases and the impacts to the different customer classes. So it could be, a good solution that we would phase those in over 2 or 3 years to move everyone where they need to be. And then at that point in time too, I'm assuming that the monthly billing would be in place and that we could look at that residential class and put the tiers in.
And do we, and maybe this isn't a question for you, Melissa, but what's our ETA on the monthly billing transition? It's always been talked about, and it's so it always seems like it's a million years away.
David, can you respond to that, please?
Good morning, everybody. David Melton, Director of Water Resources. Our plan is to finish this first phase of the AMI project. Then we'll be in a much better position to move to monthly billing. We're still scheduled for the end of 2025 for this phase of the project to be completed. So shortly after that, we would take on the task of monthly billing.
So not till 2026.
Probably, yes, FY 2026.
Right. So as we move to the next slide, and we look at the commercial and the manufacturing customer classes, one of the things that I wanted to kind of point out on these commercial and manufacturing classes, if you look, over on that far left-hand side, the tiers for each of those classes, both commercial and manufacturing, you've got a tier cutoff at 2,000 CCF on a bi-monthly basis, which is 1,000 CCF on a monthly basis. If we look at that commercial class, 83% of the usage for that class falls in tier 1. So 83% of that usage pays $4.41. 17% down there in tier 2 pays that $2.74. When we look at the manufacturing, tier 1, 28% of their usage is in that tier 1, that 0 to 2,000. Tier 2 is about 72% of the usage. So when you think about kind of those two particular classes, you've got 83% when you look at the commercial going through tier 1 and 17% getting into tier 2. And for manufacturing, 28% of the usage is in tier 1, but they've got 72% that's in tier 2. And we think about, we look at the rates for those two different tiers. On average, when we look at the commercial rate, they're paying about $4.13 per CCF, just because of the distribution of the usage between those two tiers. And for that manufacturing class, they're paying about $3.04 per CCF. So they're really getting a significant price break for that tier 2 usage. And that's part of the reason that you're seeing that discrepancy in those particular classes and why they're not kind of paying their equitable share or their fair share. One of the things that we are kind of recommending to you all is that tier 2 rate right now for the commercial class is 62% of the tier 1 rate. So basically you've got, the 274 is 62% of the 441. And then as we look at that manufacturing class, that tier 2 rate, that 250 is 57% of the 441. We're recommending to increase that tier differential so that the differential between those two different rates would only be 80% instead of that 62% and the 57% that you're seeing. And we're also recommending that we kind of put those two customer classes together, both that commercial and manufacturing, with the thinking being is most of the time when you see a two-tiered structure like that is for a non-residential class. And that second tier is really intended for manufacturing and industrial type customers. It's not necessarily kind of needed for your kind of typical commercial customer. So we're talking about kind of combining those two classes, moving that tier 2 rate up to be about 80% of that tier 1 so that you get more revenue from that second tier. but also as we look forward to rate increases for the next year, these particular classes will see kind of a higher level of rate increase than versus just say your residential class. Maggie?
So I just want to like make sure I'm following.
Yeah.
So let's take commercial, even though I know you're suggesting to combine them, which I also have some questions about, but just so I understand like the logic of what you're proposing. If you, in the commercial, if you wanted to get tier 2 closer to the 80% differential, the number that would move would be that 2000 CCF. So you would move the bar from which you transition from one to the other, or?
Oh, no. The 274. So basically, if we were to look at the 441 and the 274, we're saying that tier 2 rate, that 274 needs to be higher than what it currently is. They're getting too big of a price reduction when you get into that second tier.
So it's just about the rates.
Yeah.
And then, and the rates are similar. So the impact of if you were to merge the commercial and manufacturing is that the impact on revenue would be that the biggest revenue gain would come from tier 2 manufacturing folks.
There's a
lowest
that you would get on a percentage basis for that particular customer, that tier 2, they would see a higher rate increase. However, the biggest revenue boost would come from that commercial class just because there's so much more usage when we're looking at.
Yep, that makes sense. I'm just trying to understand.
Yep, and
I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of a business, or I mean, like trying to really understand what's in it for them and like what does this impact have? And this chart is making me do that math on the fly. I'm just trying to understand the implications of this because I don't fully understand it, and that makes me hesitant to be like, yeah, let's make sense. So I'm trying to formulate another question, but I guess just we can keep going and I can see if I can dig into my curiosity further.
Okay. And I know this is, I'm used to looking at this kind of stuff all day long, so it makes complete sense to me, but I realize that for other folks, it may be a little bit harder to follow. And by no means were we just, when we look at this chart, we're not saying that it would just be a tier 2 rate that would increase. It would also be a tier 1 rate that would increase as well, because you would need to get the benefit of raising kind of both of those rates. It would just be that second tier relative to that first tier would increase even more, just because we need to reduce that spread between those two rates.
And I guess what's the why behind combining the two? Like what's the strategy implication?
So right now, I believe there's only 9 customers in the manufacturing class. It's actually a kind of a really small class. Whoa. And there's not a lot of differentiation between the customers that are in that particular class versus what's in the commercial class. So, the definitions between those two classes and the way that those customers are defined in the data are not necessarily, clear. And, I mentioned when you have that tier 2 rate, a lot of times that tier 2 rate is put into effect to address that industrial and manufacturing type usage. So it's almost a redundant rate structure to see, both of those classes kind of having 2 tiers. And really, if you think about it, it's the same. They've got the same tier 1 rate. It's just they've got different tier 2 rates, which are both too low. So that was kind of part of the reasoning.
Manufacturing seems to be, it's like 10% of what the commercial usage is. It may have made sense historically, Maggie, that we had a manufacturing class because we had a different, going back 20, 30, 40 years. I don't know how old this rate structure is, but maybe it made
Or-
sense at some point in time.
Sense if there's like political will in economic development and attraction strategy to be like, hey, here's economic development subsidy for this type of manufacturing. I could see some of that logic of why at some time that would be there. So what I'm hearing is there's a redundancy and combining them probably would reduce admin and create efficiency and the complexities of basically maintaining different rate structures. That's the why.
And there's similar customers that are between the two classes currently. So
right. So there's not clear right now.
Right.
So it's just arbitrary, it sounds like, to some degree.
To some degree, yes.
And well, I mean, their pricing is pretty closely lined up. It's just, so anyway, I mean, I'm not sure how meaningful for the customer themselves, it may not be a meaningful difference if we combine the two categories. What will be a bigger difference to them is changing that tier.
Yes.
Tier cost.
Yeah, for recovery from that. Which is, it sounds like to me, the bottom line of all of this information, which is very helpful, Melissa, the level of depth you're providing is like, I think it's that slide where it just shows the comparison of current rates to the cost of service, and that the heavy imbalance is that residential are paying more than their fair share. And so council will have to decide if we want to figure out a path to get to more parity.
Yep.
Which I'm interested in.
Okay. Next slide. Wholesale. This is a class, if you remember that, I believe there's 3 wholesale customers. These are your other municipal districts. Currently they pay a rate, I believe it's $1.23. And one of the things that we saw here is that they were not paying their fair share of cost. I mentioned they are paying a capacity fee as part of their wholesale rate, which is a monthly fee to reserve capacity in your system. But even with that revenue from that capacity fee, that kind of monthly capacity fee revenue that they pay, that wholesale rate is still not enough. So when we bring back kind of rate adjustments in December, this will be kind of one of the recommendations will be to right size this particular class as well. Okay. Next slide. All right. So when we're talking about next steps, we're talking about presenting, rates in December for you guys to consider. Part of these rates are really going to be intended to recover some of the revenue that previous kind of capital improvement charge generated, so that we know that there's going to be a revenue increase needed. So we're most likely going to, recommend rate increases. We're going to try to minimize that rate increase to the residential class and maintain a single tier for now, but recognize that residential class is the largest class. So even if we raise rates on some of these other classes, depending on how much additional revenue is needed, that class may need to see a rate increase too. It'll just be relative to the other classes, it will be a lot less. Talking about combining commercial and manufacturing classes, having rate increases that reflect a cost of service analysis, increasing that tier 2 rate relative to the tier 1 rate to make that effective rate a little bit more meaningful in terms of equity. And I know a couple of folks have their hands up, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, I guess the question I have is back to the residential. If it will be like 2026 before the meters are installed, and then we'd have to do a study. This is a really, really long-term adjustment for citizens who don't plan ahead. What what does it take? What would it take to do this sooner and then just update it and do it again? What if we lay the foundation now and make the adjustments later? How much time does that take? How much money is that? Like we're duplicating a $500,000 effort twice. That's not a good use of taxpayer dollars. You know, what would it take to get it done now and then just redo it in 4 years?
So we've got the information to do it. You know, we've got right now, the way that we would do that is if you think about it, we've got bi-monthly billing data. So we can see kind of how those customers use the system on a bi-monthly basis. And why it's important to understand how they use the system is you're going to be with a tiered structure. You would be drawing tiers within that residential class. And just say if they were on a monthly basis, you would draw tier 1 at a 4 CCF and tier 2 at a 10 or a 12 CCF. And you would design those rates to recover that level of revenue that's required from that class. But you would want to do it to where you recovered a certain percentage of usage in tier 1, a certain percentage of usage in tier 2, and a certain percentage in tier 3. And you don't want a lot of usage out there in tier 3 because that's kind of that unstable revenue, right? Once you get over that 10 or that 12 CCF, that revenue kind of becomes unstable because you're targeting irrigation usage. And folks have control over their irrigation usage. So we would be designing that tiered structure around bi-monthly billing, and we can do it and we could put it in place. I don't know that it would necessarily, if you think about what is the purpose of a tiered structure, the purpose of a tiered structure is really to discourage discretionary water use. It's to discourage irrigation. So when in times of drought and folks are trying to irrigate and you don't want them to be doing that, you're trying to stop them from doing that. So if that's the purpose and we're doing that bi-monthly billing, if we're only billing every other month, then by the time they get their water bill, they're going to be, they're going to irrigate in just say June, but by the time they get their water bill, it's going to be the end of August. And
so you're concerned about the conservation signal.
Yeah, it just loses kind of, if you think about what the objective of tier structure is, and then you think about with the bi-monthly billing, it's not really sending those conservation signals. But
well, what if the purpose isn't solely about conservation, it's about parity? And the people who are making choices or have the need for extensive amounts of water, and I need to pay for more share of the system. So there could be a dual purpose, which could still have value while not receiving the conservation signal. Or are you saying that because of, well, it's very theoretical that the signal will be effective, therefore making that tier class unpredictable for the rates and for revenue?
The data would be a little bit cleaner if we had the monthly billing data, and that particular rate structure would be more effective. I'm not saying it can't be done. It can be done when we could, and we've got, bi-monthly billing data that we could design it around. But instead of like a 4 CCF cutoff, it would be like an 8 CCF to address the bi-monthly billing. And then we would just need to kind of cut those tiers in half and just kind of check to make sure it's working like what we intended it to once we had the monthly billing data. Kim?
Thank you, Melissa. So it would help, I think, we kind of talked about this a little bit at our agenda briefing on Thursday, but it would help me and I think help us to communicate what our options are if we had an option that is minimize rate increase to residential class and another option to freeze rate increases for residential class until we have the monthly billing structure. Like, what would the other choices be? How would we fill the gap?
And I think that if I could jump in, Ms. Ronnie, we can bring that information back to you in December, because that's when we're going to bring back kind of the rate recommendations, but we can bring those options back to you. Is that okay?
So we're not going to look at a potential next step until December for freezing the residential rates?
That is our plan. Yes, in December.
Thank you.
All right. I think I've gone through most of these bullets. I think we left off at the commercial and manufacturing rate increases reflecting the cost of service, increasing that tier 2 relative to the tier 1, definitely increasing the wholesale rates. And then there will be some rate increases to address, irrigation and multifamily, but those will not be as maybe large in proportion to the commercial, manufacturing, and the wholesale customers. All right, next slide. So the key takeaways. So we've done kind of the cost of service analysis part of the rate study. Our next steps are really, kind of understanding that financial forecast, that financial plan that Vanessa talked about, that 5 to 10 years, as we look at what is the level of revenues that are needed that we need to generate. Then what we were planning to do is kind of take the rate structure, tweak it to generate the level of revenues that we know that we need in the financial plan, and bring those rates back to you all in December. And, really kind of align the customer classes. We saw that, right now residential is paying more than its fair share versus the other classes, the commercial, manufacturing, and the wholesale classes. So we're going to align those rates to make them more equitable based on the results of that. And we will have a multi-year projection. We'll have a 5-year forecast, and we can look at either implementing those rates in 1 year and or phasing them in kind of over 2 or 3 years as we move forward. So I'll stop there if there's any more questions.
Yeah, I guess for me, my lingering concern is that if we're waiting until December, then it really limits us in the amount of flexibility that we have through our budget process and the ability to communicate and do public engagement and outreach around it. And it creates this sort of urgency that puts us in a tight spot. And I really hope that we're not going to put ourselves in that tight spot. I'd also hoped that we would see some options at this level, because we've been waiting so long to get to this point. So I guess I feel a little bit like it's possible that we didn't communicate that during the study as the city of Asheville, but I feel a little bit like we didn't achieve completion of what we need out of this part of the study. I know there's more work ahead, but I personally would hope that we wouldn't wait till December, just because, once again, that really limits our ability to do public engagement and to make choices together as a community.
Kim, let me make sure I understand your thinking around the timeline. So I think what I'm hearing is that the recommendation is going to be to not make a rate adjustment until as we approach the next fiscal year, as we would normally adjust rates every year as part of the budget process. I think as a baseline, that's what I'm hearing staff say, is that rate adjustment, we wouldn't do a mid-year rate adjustment. We would do a rate adjustment in conjunction with the budget cycle. And I think what I hear you saying is December might be too late to start talking about rate adjustments, even if it's in a budget cycle. Or are you saying, am I not understanding what you're saying about the timing on the rate adjustment?
I'll reiterate it in a different way. Number one, if we wait until December, folks are going to be really upset that we're waiting to the last minute when we don't have as much time to make a decision in the budget cycle. And number two, we have lots of questions about transparency and public engagement and how we do outreach. And there's so much happening at the end of the year. Folks, have a lot of familial obligations and travel. So it feels a little bit like we're not giving ourselves as much time if we wait until December. Additionally, if we're going to have this study say the path forward is minimize residential rate increases, I need another option of what the impact looked like to freeze residential rate increases.
And we plan to bring that information back to you in December.
Okay, so in December, Deborah, if I understand you, we would have a recommendation around rates for the next fiscal year, and then we would also have this sort of option B that Councilwoman Roney's talking about, where what does it look like to freeze residential rates while we make I think Kim, what you're saying is freeze residential rates while we bring the other rates in line with the cost of service or that rate,
that's exactly
payer.
Right. That's exactly what I've said for the past 3 budget cycles. So yes, that is exactly right.
So, we don't adopt the budget until the end of June. So December, doesn't quite feel squished up for me, but I see what you're saying in terms of we get into all the discussions. Deborah, why don't we leave it? You hear the request. Is there a way to accelerate it? It doesn't sound like you guys can quite answer that on the spot right now. So maybe get back to us about whether there's a way to move that timeline up.
And we definitely would not be asking you all to make a decision in December.
Oh no, I hear what you're saying. I don't think, and I think what I think, I understand that you're not saying make a decision in December. I think you're saying wait for our recommendation in December. And I think what Kim is saying is, well, but then what happens? You get the recommendation, then you got to work with all these, we got to go out into the community and talk about what the options are. And then, obviously if we're making adjustments to commercial and industrial users, there's sort of the outreach that needs to happen with those users so they understand. We probably need to take this presentation to the chamber or other places where those sorts of users would hear this information and understand the why behind why we would be making these changes.
Absolutely. And as we said, actually as part of at the end of the budget process, we said that this process would not be completed until late fall. And we think you're coming in kind of early. So, again, I think I am hearing the direction of that you want us to look at the potential for freezing for residential, but we need the time to understand the implications of doing that on the rest of the ratepayers as well as on the capital budget and projects that are scheduled to be either underway or completed. That's what takes the time in terms of the analysis and assessment of different models.
Another variable just to throw into the conversation on the timing is like what I'm hearing the most when I'm talking to businesses, when I'm saying, we're expecting to get this information back and that basically commercial's getting highly subsidized. And I hear businesses saying, I understand, just give us time and be very clear. And so, no one wants rate changes. But I think there's a couple balls that we're trying to juggle, right? Is Deborah, I'm hearing you say, do the analysis with the rigor that's necessary to run the utility. We don't want to compromise that. I'm hearing Kim say, let's do community engagement. So before we make decisions, people are involved. And then we also need to do this in enough time so that people can financially plan so that they're not like, we decide in June and then the rate hits them in July. And so doing all of those things, it seems like, and if I recall, I feel like when we were talking about this, we were talking about the potential to make rate changes in January, not just get the report back, that we wanted to be part of the conversation in the fall. So I too would be curious to see like how far we can accelerate this so that if we're going to make changes that are going to be hard for the commercial sector to absorb, they have as much time as possible.
And to add my take on this too, I thought we had talked about making changes to commercial and manufacturing rates in January as well. And that's why it feels like we're probably abandoning that at this point. But if we're not, then we need to talk about the impact sooner.
Understood.
I noticed there's a few more slides on, or well, maybe not on the one that was linked to the agenda. There's some, but maybe we're not supposed to go through those, but they just look at other cities and their rates and rate structures. Do we need to talk any about those?
That wasn't our intention there. With the last slide was the key.
That was just for information.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, are we done with this topic? We got to talk about how much more of this agenda we can get through today. It's already 11:30. So
totally agree, ma'am. We kind of warned you all that this one was going to be pretty dense, and yeah.
I appreciate it. I think it was you know, thorough, and I think you know the education piece of it around how you look at rates and design rates is helpful for us that aren't working in that industry all the time, and I appreciate that. So thank you, Melissa and Vanessa. Okay, everybody, so our agenda here, so we're at 11:30 and we've got this CIP and bond items here. Deborah and I, when we were kind of reviewing this agenda ahead of the meeting, we agreed that we weren't likely to get through this agenda today. So do you all have time to keep going, or should we move these to the next meeting? Staff, do you have, I know you guys said the audit item and the work plan item, we could move off. Tell me what you're thinking about the CIP and the bond item.
Mayor, if folks have time, we could get through the CIP discussion, I believe, in about 10 minutes, depending upon questions. But it's totally up to you all and the members if they have time.
Yeah, that's fine with me. How about Kim and Maggie? What do you all think? Do you have some time?
I have to jump, unfortunately, but I could watch the video if you all proceed.
There's no, we can move it, Mayor. We can delay.
Okay. All right. So we'll conclude the meeting now and come back to those items at our next meeting. And I'll talk to staff if we need to squeeze in an additional finance meeting before our next scheduled finance meeting, we'll figure that out.
Yeah, I'm flexible for that too. I know CIP, there's so much work happening and the presentation was very helpful, but I'm sure discussion would be valuable too.
That'd be great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. So that concludes our meeting for today.
Mayor, just as there was no public comment.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Thank you for telling me. Yes, I'm sorry. I'm speeding ahead. All right. Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Okay.